Welcome back as we continue this conversation with Jerry Blassingame and Kate Weaver Patterson about stories of incarceration and reentry.
All right. So, Kate, what are the effects of a parent's incarceration on children? And I have a feeling you've got a boatload of information for us.
I do. How long do you have? So I actually just testified in front of the Joint Committee on Children about this very issue because there is a host of data out there about the incredible impact of incarceration on children. Of the 2.2 million people we incarcerate in the United States, about 1 in 5 has a child support obligation, and half are parents. So when we talk about people we're incarcerating, at least half of them are parents and have children who are impacted. And what the data shows us is that incarceration impacts a child's mental health. It impacts their physical health. It impacts the chance of them being incarcerated themselves. So if you have a parent who is incarcerated, much like we see in cycles of a lot of different things like domestic abuse, if you have a parent who is incarcerated, you are more likely to be incarcerated. The other thing that this does, and the reason that we see these incredibly detrimental impacts on children is when someone's incarcerated, that removes that parent from that child's life. So their ability to interact, to be there for birthdays and Christmases, and just the nighttime conversations that those of us not inside are lucky enough to have with our kids, that is removed. And even if that child is able to see the parent who is incarcerated, it can often be a very traumatic experience for children to go into prisons and interact with their parent in that way. Sometimes they're not able to touch that parent. Sometimes they are seeing that parent through plexiglass. Those visits are very controlled in a way that doesn't lend itself to a natural parent-child relationship. And so we see that these relationships themselves are broken down, which leads to negative impacts for the kids and negative impacts for the parents. And one of the important things that I think a lot of times folks don't realize with child support in particular, and I could go on for an hour just about that, but in states like South Carolina, child support continues to accrue while people are incarcerated, which means they come out with enormous debt. And then one of the mechanisms by which we enforce failure to pay child support is reincarcerating people. So we have people who get out of jail who struggle to find a job, who were not able to pay child support and support that child financially or emotionally while they were actually inside. And now they are in a position where they are unable to pay their past due child support, which often is in the tens of thousands of dollars, and they are reincarcerated for failure to pay. And so it turns into, this is an overused term, but I think it's so appropriate here, a vicious cycle that people, particularly those living in poverty, find it very difficult to break out of.
Those are hard things to hear. And you mentioned earlier about, on our last episode, about that collateral consequences and that cycle. And that seems to be a little bit more about some of those recursive things that keep happening in that cycle. Thank you for sharing that. How about you, Jerry? What are some of the effects of a parent's incarceration on children?
I'm going to share a story because I was incarcerated and I had 3 small kids. So I have some qualitative data that I can share about, I have all my sons, my 3 older sons, they're older in their 30s, 20s and 30s now. And it took me, 10 years to build relationships with them again. They were hurt. They were traumatized as well. They didn't even want to come and see me while I was incarcerated. I didn't get to do homework with my children and, didn't get to throw football with them and take them to sports events as young boys. And, that hurt, when a man and a son don't get to, do those things together, it hurts relationships. Not only our relationship, but even, I've talked to one of my sons about, relationship with girlfriends and women and how that even our relationship affects his relationship with other relationships. And so we don't think about that, the effect on children. And so that's why when I got out, I vowed that I would never do anything that would take me back. And I would try to keep as many people out, that I can, and help as many that were coming out that I can, because, children are our future. And I want to make sure that, our children have the best education, the best home life, they can have. So those are just, some stories from my own life, how bad it is for children who have parents, who are incarcerated. And I'll add this, I got 2 daughters, they're having experienced incarceration, but it is so important for dads to spend time with their young girls. Mm-hmm. Young girls need to understand what is a right touch and a wrong touch. Then they need to understand what is a hug, and dads open up their car doors for them and things like that. So there are a lot of dads who wasn't able to open up a car door for their daughter or give them a kiss or a hug or things like that. And some of these women have been taught the wrong things by men who maybe abused them. So, yeah.
Thank you, Jerry. Appreciate your vulnerability in sharing this. That was very powerful.
Thank you.
So, Jerry, if you could institute some public policy changes, what would you do?
Oh, wow. Think about a lot of things. I don't think people should spend the rest of their life being punished for something they did when they were a teenager or something they did when they were 20 or 21. We just got a first felony expungement bill passed 2 years ago in South Carolina, first offense drug charges. Took a long time, and we're still slow to do more. It was that's it for now. It might, people say it might be 5 or 10 years, but Kate and I don't believe that. We're still working. But I believe when if a person commit a crime and they've been out, they should get their record clean if they haven't, reoffended. So that's probably one of the things that I would do, because, the criminal background hurts so many Americans, people who have worked hard and ready to buy homes and, get bank accounts and get the right jobs or even rent a home. It just hurts. I hate that fact. And, one of the things that Kate's working on right now, that child support issue is another thing too. I just hate that when people are, in jail, that it's still accruing. It's, they're still charging you, and that's just so bad. But those are just a couple of things right off the top of my head, that I think. And I will say this, because this is one of my pet peeves. I got a pardon, 14 years ago for now, and it's a crime I committed over 25 years ago. And when you get a pardon in South Carolina, your record is not expunged. And I believe a pardon means that you're forgiven, should mean you're forgiven. So I just think that when you get a pardon in South Carolina or any state, that your record needs to be expunged. And time is a great indicator for that. I don't think a person should get out of prison 1 year and the next year get a pardon if they haven't proven themselves. I proved myself, and I believe that we all should prove ourselves. But when a person gets a pardon, and if the governor or a pardon board, grants a pardon, they need to make sure that the person can respectfully rebuild their life with all the impediments of the collateral consequences.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Jerry. What would you add to that, Kate?
So Jerry and I have an ongoing joke yet serious discussion that we have a 1-year plan, a 5-year plan, and a 10-year plan when it comes to policy change, because there is so much to be done and so much that we want to do. I will say that I agree, one, with everything that Jerry said. And one thing I would add to that is, beyond being able to expunge pardons, I'm a firm believer that we need to expand what can be expunged, like Jerry said, so that some of these things that happened years and years ago don't follow folks around. Look, I was a sex crimes prosecutor, and I have 2 small children, a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old. I do not want, and I understand people's appropriate reticence of having someone who's been convicted of abusing a child teaching in a school. There are certain public safety measures that are appropriate for us to put in place, but that has been so expanded to the point of things that are of very little consequence that continue to be a barrier to folks. So I completely agree with Jerry on the expansion of expungements and pardons. Along those lines, and along the line of something that we had talked about earlier, with regard to how we view people in the system and whether they can be rehabilitated. In South Carolina, folks aren't entitled to a lawyer for their parole hearing because we consider parole to be a privilege and not a right. So I have a client, and this is just one example of many. We are currently incarcerating more than 16,000 people in South Carolina, just in SEDC, not to include the thousands in county jails. But I have a client who was 17 years old when he was convicted of murder. He was not the shooter, but he was with a group and was convicted under something that we call the hand of one, hand of all, which means that because he was part of this group in this altercation where someone tragically ended up dead, he has been in prison for the last 26 years. He has done absolutely everything that the system could have required of him. He has had no disciplinary actions. He has gotten his GED. He now teaches the GED classes at his facility. He helped start the character dorm. And he has been up for parole 9 times, and he has been rejected every time because of the nature of his offense, which is the one thing that he can do nothing to change. So one of the major changes that I would make is around the due process protections in our parole system and the recognition of when the system is doing what it purports to do, which is the ability to put out someone who is changed. And so often, even when people have taken advantage of that, despite the obstacles that they have while incarcerated, we continue to tell them no. So I think that the due process protections to include a lawyer and additional legislative and court oversight of the parole process is really important. Protections around discrimination with regard to employment and housing with a criminal record are very important. There are certain federal protections in place, but oftentimes with convictions, people are kept out of employment and housing. And so one major thing that we've seen around the country and are beginning to see in South Carolina to include Greenville City is called ban the box, which means that on an initial application for housing or employment, someone cannot ask the question if you've been convicted of a felony. That doesn't mean that you can't run that rap sheet later. Again, going back to some of our public safety concerns, but it means that someone doesn't look at the application and immediately discard it because they see a felony conviction on that person's record. And I'll mention in conclusion, the 2 things that we're working on this year primarily. One is the child support issue that I mentioned and the fact that child support debt should not accrue while someone is currently incarcerated. And the second is the fact that the South Carolina is the last state in the union that continues to ban individuals with any sort of drug felony from SNAP benefits. So that means that someone who has a drug felony at any point is prohibited from receiving those benefits, which has a huge impact on that person and their family, particularly when that felony may also be keeping them from any sort of gainful employment.
Wow. I mean, we've talked a lot about the barriers and these policies that prevent successful reentry. And I think we've really nailed a lot of these barriers. But I'd love to hear from you, Jerry, because this seems to be some of the inspiration of your 3.5 years and what you walked out of there with a plan. What are the indicators that support reentry?
Yeah. So, I believe, safe quality housing, when somebody get out of prison, they have to have somewhere to lay their head. Okay. You have to have employment. I've seen people that get out, they're sleeping on the street, they're sleeping, in abandoned houses, and they can't function because they don't have a safe place to sleep. So we have to have housing. We have to have employment. Some people need education. Mentoring is huge. We have to have these things. Somebody has to walk, with somebody, and in the Christian world, we call it discipleship. You need somebody to walk with you to help you because you don't have all the tools you need. And so These things are essential, to help men and women, get out. And if a woman gets out and she's got children that a caretaker has been taking care of, as soon as she gets out, the caretaker hands her the baby and say, I'm done. And so now you got a woman with a young child, if she can get the child back. So these things are essential to make sure that, the reentry process works. And I don't think the average citizen understands that. They think, well, they did their time. They need to go out and do better. How can you do better? Martin Luther King said it best. You can't, pull yourself up by your own bootstrap if you don't have boots. Most people get out shoeless. And so, we need to understand that. And so that's why we do what we do. Men and women, when they get out, they need the essential services, the bare minimum, just to feel dignity. Most of us get up every morning or take a shower, brush our teeth, comb our hair. Everybody want to do that. Everybody needs to be able to get up and do that. It's tough when you don't have, those essentials. And so, these services are paramount to a person feeling like a human being.
I so appreciate those answers, Jerry, and just the passion that you understand that that's an essential thing for the reentry success.
I lived it. I walked it. So.
I bet. Yeah. How about you, Kate? What are some indicators that are supportive for reentry?
I echo everything that Jerry said, and I would add 3 things. One is medical care, particularly mental health support, because having been incarcerated can cause so much trauma that then can lead to really detrimental impact on both that person and their family who's interacting with them. I would say family support. Jerry's story, I think, is such a beautiful example of how that family support is critical to success. And the flip side of that is when folks don't have that family support. A lot of times people get out, and like Jerry said, they get out, metaphorically shoeless, but oftentimes it's almost literally shoeless. They will drop you, give you a bus ticket and $20 and say, best of luck. There are stories that are really horrifying about folks who are released. There was one guy who was a paraplegic. He was in a wheelchair in Colombia, and he was on the sex offender registry, which makes finding housing incredibly difficult. And he was simply left outside on the sidewalk outside one of the missions there. And so without that family support, without a place to go, I say to people all the time, we cannot be surprised about our level of reincarceration when people get out and they don't have any options. And if they don't have that family support, which a lot of times has been torn apart because of the incarceration and events that led to it, that reintegration is even more difficult. The third thing is legal support. And I think that that's something that is often overlooked. And Jerry recognized how critical that is to success, which is the reason that the partnership between Soteria and Root and Rebound exists. The collateral consequences and legal barriers that we've talked about can be really difficult to navigate without a lawyer, and are often, their collateral consequences are legally based, right? This is the punishment that comes from a criminal record that continues is often enshrined in statute and in court cases. And so the legal assistance cannot be the only tool. Those other areas of survival, of housing, of family support, of medical attention have to be there. But to really kind of allow someone to break free from some of these chains of collateral consequences, legal assistance is often essential.
Wow. Thank you so much. This has been an enormous education. And I'm sure, hopefully we can put some of these stories out into our listeners' ears as well. Thank you for sharing that.
So very quickly, what's a metaphor to help us understand the realities of incarceration and reentry? Just jump right in there.
We love this question.
I was just thinking about that, and I said, you know what? It's like jumping out of a pot into the frying pan, because if it's not done right, but, reentry, if it's done right, it's a safety net. It's like an incubator. I look at it as a training ground for people who get out of that pot or get out of that cage, that concrete jungle. And, there's a place where men and women can go and get their life, set back on the right track through the reentry process.
That's beautiful.
And I would say, Jerry, that you gave me my idea, which I appreciate, which is very similar, but I think is that it's just telling of what we see every day. So my metaphor for getting out of prison and reentry would be, it's like jumping out of an airplane or perhaps being pushed out of an airplane. And the question is whether or not you have a parachute. And that parachute would be the reentry services that Jerry and I have discussed. But without that parachute, without that support, without those services, you're jumping to an almost certain catastrophe. And I think folks really struggle to understand this idea of recidivism and why people reoffend. People reoffend because they get out of prison. They have, with a bus ticket, they are living in a halfway house that is unlikely to be like Soteria with rules and guidelines, but is instead, just a bed if they're lucky. They can't find a job. They can't find other housing. And then people are going to survive, right? And people are going to feed their children. And I say this to groups a lot. Sometimes I think I surprise the church groups that I speak to, which I think I can say as a preacher's kid, I would do whatever I had to do to feed my children, whether that was sell my body, whether that was sell drugs, whatever I had to do to feed my children, I would do. And if people say that they wouldn't, they are either lying or they aren't that great of a parent. And so when we put folks in these situations where they have no other options, we cannot be surprised when they choose survival by the only means that they know.
Wow. Thank you so much. Oh, Jerry, how can people find you and your work at Soteria?
Our website is www.soteriacdc.org. And we also have a website for our social enterprise is soteriaatwork.com.
And if I can just shout that out as someone who has a beautiful bed swing on my back porch that our guys at Soteria made, that is my favorite place in the world to sit, particularly in COVID times when the only joy we get is from being outside. I really encourage folks to check out Soteria at Work, because not only are you supporting our guys, you get just stunningly beautiful furniture.
Yes, absolutely. And we'll post that on our show notes and website as well. Jerry, thank you so much for sharing that. Kate, how can we help support Roots and Rebound?
So our website is rootandrebound.org, or if you just Google Root and Rebound South Carolina, you will find us and an opportunity there to learn about our work and what we do. We would love for folks to join us in our campaigns for criminal justice reform with the Second Chance Justice Collaborative. And so really encourage folks to look at what we do, to support us through volunteering, to support monetarily if they're so inclined, and to really think about ways that they would like to be involved in the political process to help us make some systemic change.
Thank you so much.
Well, special thanks to Jerry Blassingame of Soteria and Kate Weaver Patterson of Roots and Rebound. Join us next week as we talk about the effects and appeal of negative stories in social media. We'll discuss what fuels moral outrage on social media and what effects outrage narratives will have on human beings. We'll be talking with Rob Henderson, PhD student at Cambridge University, and Dylan Smith, the content director for Carey Nieuwhof Communications. In the meantime,
we want to make sure that you know how to leave us a review, rate us on iTunes and Apple Podcasts, become a subscriber to the afterwordpodcast.com. We now are on Google Podcasts as well. Thanks in advance for your review. It does help us keep the conversation going. And as always, remember, you are welcome at our table.